The richest man in Dusty Creek thought his ledgers were clean until one page revealed his money had helped build the very place that destroyed an innocent girl's life. Clara Preston came to town looking for work, but she carried a black book filled with names, crimes, and secrets that could shake Texas to its foundation. What began as gossip became a fight for justice, family, and redemption. This story teaches us that silence has a cost, and truth always finds daylight. Like, comment, share. And subscribe if you believe justice still matters.
The red dust of Dusty Creek didn't care about a person's business. It just clung to you. It settled into the cracks of your boots, lined the brim of your hat, and turned the sweat on the back of your neck to rust by noon. By sunset, the whole world looked like it was bleeding. 3 years of drought will do that to a place. It dries up the creeks, kills the grass, and shrinks the charity right out of a man's chest. Jedediah Walker pulled the leather reins, bringing his bay gelding to a halt near the eastern boundary line of the Walker Ranch. He wiped his brow with the back of his gloved hand. Down the ridge, about a mile off, the tri-weekly stagecoach from Fort Worth was rolling in. It kicked up a long, lazy plume of orange dirt that hung in the stagnant air like a scar. Jed didn't pay it much mind. The stage usually brought 3 things: mail that was late, salt blocks for the cattle, or some land speculator looking to buy out a starving homesteader for pennies on the dollar. He spat into the dirt and went back to his fencing. A man didn't survive out here by watching the horizon. He survived by keeping his wire tight. By the time Jed rode into town an hour later, the sun was sitting heavy and low on the rooftops of the Copper Nail Saloon. He hitched his horse outside Guthrie's dry goods store. He needed a keg of fencing staples, but the moment he stepped onto the wooden boardwalk, he felt the change in the air. Dusty Creek only had 300 people. When a stone fell into a pond that small, everybody felt the ripple. Right then, the ripple was standing on the porch of the Mercantile. She was young, 18, maybe. She wore a traveling dress of plain gray wool that had seen better days, stained around the hem by the long road from the east. Her auburn hair was pinned up, but a few stray curls hung loose, framing a face that looked entirely too pale for the Texas sun. But it was her eyes that caught him. They were a sharp, defiant green, guarding her like the high walls of an infantry fort. She was holding a single small suitcase with a sawn leather handle. She was entirely alone, no kin waiting, no husband to take her bag. Inside the store, Mrs. Guthrie was leaning over the counter, her sharp nose practically twitching with suspicion. Through the open window, her voice carried clear into the evening air. "Fort Worth is a long ride for a girl by herself," Mrs. Guthrie said, her tone flat, lacking the usual neighborly warmth. "We don't get many folks coming down the line without a destination, Miss Preston. This town is small. We look after our own, but we don't much care for mysteries." Clara Preston didn't flinch. She kept her chin up, though Jed could see the subtle tremor in her jaw. "I'm not a mystery, ma'am," Clara said. Her voice was soft, but it had a steady, rhythmic cadence to it, like water flowing over smooth creek stones. "I am a woman looking for honest work. I can read, I can write, and I can cipher numbers quicker than most men. If you have need of someone to keep your ledgers clean, my hands are capable." Behind Jed, a soft scoff broke the quiet. He turned his head. Ruth Hensley, the preacheress' wife, was standing near the rain barrel, her arms crossed tight over her chest. She was whispering to old Mr. Miller, but she wasn't hiding her words. "A young thing like that, coming off the Fort Worth stage with nothing but a hand baggage," Ruth muttered, her lips thinning into a bitter line. "No family to speak of, no wedding band. I lived long enough to know what kind of women come out of the Fort Worth districts when the night falls. She's fleeing a bad name, mark my words. A stain like that don't wash out in the desert." Jed looked back at the girl on the porch. She had heard it. He knew she had, because her knuckles turned white around the handle of her suitcase. But she didn't look down. She didn't give them the satisfaction of her shame. Jedediah stepped through the threshold of the store, the spurs on his boots giving a low, metallic ring against the pine floorboards. Both women looked up. "Evenin', Mrs. Guthrie," Jed said, removing his hat. "Jedediah." The old woman nodded, her attention momentarily diverted. "You here for your father's order? Just need a keg of staples and some axle grease," Jed said. He didn't look directly at Clara. but he stood close enough to see the exhaustion etched deep into her skin. Her skin was chafed, and her palms, visible where her gloves had worn through at the thumbs, were raw and blistered from the rough hemp rope of the stagecoach luggage straps. A human being wasn't a horse to be measured by the flaws in her coat. She was a person, breathing the same dust, trying to find a patch of shade in a hard world. Without a word, Jed reached into his vest pocket. He didn't offer her charity in front of a crowd was just another way of branding a person poor. Instead, he walked over to the counter, picked up a small tin of skin-soothing tallow, and set it down right beside her battered suitcase. He looked Mrs. Guthrie straight in the eye. "A person's dignity don't belong to the crowd, Mrs. Guthrie," Jed said. His voice was a low, gravelly drawl, but it carried the weight of the Walker name. "The law of this territory says a man or a woman is free to walk the road until they give a reason to be stopped. Out here on the frontier, we survive because we judge a person by the work they do today, not the ghost stories the neighbors like to whisper." Mrs. Guthrie blinked, her face flushing slightly. She looked at the tin of tallow, then at Clara. The hardness in the old woman's eyes didn't vanish, but it cracked just a little. "The storeroom needs sorting, Miss Preston," Mrs. Guthrie said, her voice dropping an octave. "The boxes are heavy. If your penmanship is as clean as your talk, we'll see about the ledgers tomorrow. You can sleep in the back quarters tonight. There is a cot." Clara let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since she crossed the county line. She looked at the tin of tallow on the counter, then raised her green eyes to Jed. "Thank you, Mr. Walker," she whispered. Jed simply nodded, placing his hat back on his head. Miss Preston. Later that night, the wind picked up, howling through the gaps in the boardwalks of Dusty Creek. Inside the dark storeroom of the Mercantile, Clara sat on the edge of the small canvas cot. The air smelled of dried beans, burlap, and old iron. Her hands were greasy from the tallow. It stopped the stinging. Slowly, she reached into her small suitcase. She bypassed the spare shawl and the single pair of stockings, her fingers tracing the rough fabric until they found what she was looking for: a small leather-bound ledger. It was entirely black. She pulled it to her chest, hugging it tightly against her ribs as she listened to the wind shake the window panes. Her heart hammered against her breastbone, a frantic, trapped thing, just long enough to start over. She whispered into the empty dark, "Just let me stay whole until tomorrow." The first week of a Texas drought doesn't kill a town. That's the fourth month that does it. The dust gets into the flour sacks. It gets into the gears of the town clock until the brass hands slow down and stop, leaving everyone stranded in a long, endless noon. Clara Preston didn't seem to mind the heat, or maybe she was just running from a worse kind of fire. By the third morning, she was the first one to touch the front door latch of Guthrie's Dry Goods. She didn't wait for the sun to clear the ridge. She swept the boardwalk before the milk wagons rolled in. She scrubbed the grease off the molasses barrels until the white oak hoops showed their grain. Mrs. Guthrie noticed. A woman like that doesn't say much, but she watches the corners of a room. If the corners are clean, she figures the soul isn't completely rotted out by Thursday. She had moved Clara off the heavy lifting and put her behind the big pine desk at the back of the store. Jed Walker found a reason to check that desk 3 times in 5 days. The first time he needed a pound of chicory to mix with his father's coffee. The second time it was a box of horse liniment. By the third time, he was just standing there, his leather work gloves tucked into his belt, looking at the way her fingers held a nib pen. Her ink strokes were small, neat. They didn't slant or shake like the handwriting of a frightened girl. "My father needs a load of seed grain delivered to the tenant farm on the lower creek," Jed said, his voice dropping into that easy rhythmic drawl. He leaned one elbow on the counter. "The mule team is stubborn. The wagon box needs 2 people, one to hold the brake, one to keep the team from slipping on the dry shale. Mrs. Guthrie says you ciphered the invoice. Thought you might want to see where the grain goes." Clara didn't look up immediately. She finished her line in the ledger, blew softly on the wet black ink, and then raised her green eyes. "Does the work pay extra, Mr. Walker?" "$50, Jed said. "And a noon meal under the cottonwoods." "I'll fetch my shawl," she said. The road to the lower creek was nothing but 2 deep ruts worn into the limestone. The sun sat on their shoulders like a hot iron. For the first 3 miles, neither of them spoke. That was the way of the country. Out here, words were like water. You didn't waste them on an empty belly or an empty road. Jed kept his eyes on the mule's ears. Clara sat with her hands folded over her gray wool skirt. "You hold a pen like a schoolteacher," Jed said after they crossed the dry bed of Willow Creek. Not many folks down from the northern counties have that kind of hand. My mother was a minister's daughter from Ohio, Clara said. Her voice kept time with the creak of the wagon axle. She believed a woman without letters was just a prisoner to whatever man held her ledger. She taught me to read before I could cook a decent meal. Jed nodded. He shifted the leather reins between his fingers. She sounds like a woman who looked ahead. She died when the winter fever hit Fort Worth, Clara said simply. Sometimes looking ahead just shows you a wall. Jed didn't offer pity. Pity was like mud. It didn't help a wagon get up a hill instead. He pulled the team to a stop beneath a rare patch of shade where an old cottonwood tree grew out of a rock seam. He reached behind the seat, pulled out a tin canteen and handed it to her. "The drought don't last forever, Miss Preston," Jed said, his eyes scanning the pale blue horizon. "The old teamers say the land has a memory. It remembers the rain even when the mud turns to powder. A human being has to be the same way. You can't let one bad season tell you the soil is dead." Clara took a sip from the canteen. The water was warm, tasting of tin and iron, but it cleared the dust from her throat. She looked at him, her gaze lingering on the scar that ran from his ear down into his collar. "And what if the season lasted 2 years, Mr. Walker? What if the ground was poisoned before you ever set foot on it?" Jed took the canteen back and screwed the cap tight. "Then you dig a deeper well," he said. "You dig until you find something clean." The trouble didn't wait for them on the road. It waited until Sunday morning. The bell at the community church was clanging, a flat, tinny sound that broke the morning quiet. The congregation was moving up the steps, women in their best calico dresses, men with their hair slicked down with pomade. Clara walked alone from the mercantile. She wore her gray dress, but she had washed the collar until it was white as bone. She held a small, black leather Bible her mother had left her. She hadn't reached the third step before Ruth Hensley stepped out from the double doors. The preacher's wife stood like a sentinel, her black silk skirts rustling like dry corn husks in the wind. 3 other women from the altar guild stood behind her, their faces set like flint. "This is a house of worship, Miss Preston," Ruth said, her voice high and clear enough to make the folks on the boardwalk stop and turn. "We spent 5 years building these walls to keep the wilderness out. We don't intend to let the filth of the Fort Worth districts walk through the front door." Clara stopped. Her foot was still on the first step. The sun hit her face, showing every pale line of her skin. She didn't drop her Bible, but her arm went rigid against her side. "I came to hear the sermon, ma'am," Clara said, her voice dropping low. "The word is for the decent," Ruth replied, her chin rising. "Go back to the dry goods store. Or better yet, take the afternoon stage back to where you belong. A small town has a long memory for women of your stripe." Jed Walker was 50 yards away, hitching his father's team to the rail. He didn't run. A man didn't run in the heat unless a horse was loose. But his boots struck the wooden steps with a heavy, deliberate rhythm that made the other men move aside. He stepped onto the porch, his tall frame cutting off the sun and throwing a long shadow over Ruth Hensley. "Mrs. Hensley," Jed said, his hat already in his hand. He didn't look angry. He looked like a judge checking a boundary line. "Jedediah," Ruth said, her tone softening just a fraction. "Your father is already inside. You ought to join him. We are simply protecting the sanctuary from those who don't respect the laws of a Christian community." Jed turned his eyes to the crowd gathered on the grass below. They were watching, waiting to see which way the wind blew. "The laws of this country don't have a checkpoint at the church door, Mrs. Hensley," Jed said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the cadence of an iron bar hitting an anvil. "The Constitution gives every citizen the right to stand under the law without being hounded by their neighbors. And if I recall the text my father reads every night, the Savior didn't ask the woman at the well for her marriage certificate before he offered her a drink." Ruth's face turned the color of a beet. "Jedediah Walker, you have no right to use the scripture to defend. I have the right of a man who helped pay for the timber in these floors." Jed cut in, his voice dropping into a deeper, colder register. "And I have the right of a human being who knows that a person's soul belongs to God, not to a committee of women with nothing better to do than measure their neighbor's sins. Miss Preston is an employee of this town. She has earned her bread by the sweat of her brow this week. If that ain't Christian, then we might as well burn the pews for firewood." He turned to Clara. He didn't offer his arm that would have been an insult to her independent strength in front of these wolves. Instead, he simply stepped back, leaving the doorway clear. "After you, Miss Preston," Jed said. Clara looked at him for one long second. The green in her eyes wasn't frightened anymore. It was bright, like grass after a flash rain. She lifted her skirts, walked past Ruth Hensley without looking at her, and stepped through the doors into the cool, dark sanctuary. Jed followed her. He didn't look back at the porch. He knew the town would talk, but out here, talk didn't keep the cattle alive, and it didn't make a wrong thing right. The parlor at the Walker Ranch smelled of beeswax, old leather, and horse liniment. It was a man's house, solid timber, high ceilings, and no curtains on the windows to block the view of the western ridge. Silas Walker sat at the end of the long oak table, his silver mustache neatly trimmed, his white shirt buttoned to the throat despite the evening heat. He didn't look like a man who spent his days in the saddle, but his wrists were as thick as fence posts, and his blue eyes had the cold clarity of creek ice. Clara sat across from him. She had been invited because the Walker Ranch needed its quarterly books balanced before the tax assessor came down from Austin. Jed had spent 2 hours convincing his father that the girl from the mercantile was the only one in the county who could tell the difference between a depreciated mule team and an outstanding beef credit. Silas watched her pull the massive ledger toward her. He didn't speak for a long time. He just watched her hand, the way she dipped the steel nib, the way she didn't spill a drop of ink on his clean cedar table. "You're fast with the numbers, Miss Preston," Silas said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumbling that sounded like a wagon crossing a dry bridge. "Numbers don't lie, Mr. Walker," Clara said without looking up. "They don't have opinions, and they don't change their minds when the weather turns bad. If you spend $5 on salt, the ledger says $5. It doesn't ask if the salt was worth the price." Silas let out a dry, short bark of a laugh. He leaned back, his big hands flat on his thighs. "I like a realistic outlook. Most women from the eastern towns come here expecting poetry and roses. Texas don't grow roses unless you haul the water yourself." "I didn't come for the scenery, sir," Clara said. Jed stood by the cold stone fireplace, his shoulder resting against the mantelpiece. He didn't say a word. He just watched the light from the oil lamp catch the side of Clara's face. For the first time since she had arrived in Dusty Creek, she looked like she belonged inside a house, not a storeroom, not a wagon box, a home. By 9 o'clock the ledger was closed, and Silas had retired to his bedroom with his pipe. The house went quiet, save for the rhythmic clicking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Jed walked Clara out to the wide front porch. The night air was cooler now, a gentle breeze coming off the caprock, carrying the scent of dry sage and distant rain that would never fall. The stars were out, millions of white sparks scattered across a black velvet sky that seemed to go on into eternity. Clara leaned against the cedar railing, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Your father doesn't like me," she said into the dark. "My father doesn't like anything he didn't build himself," Jed replied, stepping up beside her. He didn't crowd her. He stood close enough to feel the warmth of her wool dress, but far enough to give her room to breathe. "But he respects the way you handled that book. He told me before he went to bed that you had a man's head for business and a lady's manners." That's high praise from Silas Walker. Clara looked out at the dark shapes of the cattle sleeping in the home pasture. "He looks at me like he's trying to remember a face he saw in a bad dream." "He's just old," Jed said gently. "He thinks everyone who comes off the Fort Worth stage is a land agent or a carpetbagger from the Reconstruction days. He don't know you yet." Jed paused. He reached down, his fingers brushing against the rough cedar of the rail, just inches from her hand. "But I like to know you, Clara. Not just the woman who balances the mercantile books. I've been watching you for 3 weeks. You look like a person who's constantly waiting for someone to hit her from behind." Clara didn't move. Her profile was sharp against the starlight. "You shouldn't look too close, Jed," she said, her voice dropping into a whisper that was almost lost in the wind. "Sometimes when you look into an old well, you just find dead things at the bottom." "I've seen dead things," Jed said. He turned his body toward her, his face serious. "I was 22 when I went down to the border with the Rangers. I saw towns burned to the ground. I saw men killed for a pair of boots. A past don't frighten me, Clara. Every man out here has a trail of dust behind him. It's the direction the horse is heading that matters." Clara turned to him then. Her eyes were dark, nearly black in the starlight, but they were wide and wet. The defiance was gone, replaced by an old, heavy exhaustion that made her look 30 instead of 18. "You don't understand," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "You think I'm a lady who fell on hard times. You think my father lost his farm and I had to take a clerk's job. That's the story I let Mrs. Guthrie believe." She took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling beneath the gray wool. "After my mother died, our landlord took the furniture. He took everything. A man came to the boarding house, a man named Blackjack Vance. He wore a gold watch chain and smelled of expensive tobacco. He told me he had a place for a literate girl at his establishment in Fort Worth. He said I'd be a receptionist. A secretary. She stopped. She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together. It was the Silver Moon Saloon. Jed. It wasn't an office. It was a house girl's cage. He had an old man, a temporary guardian, the county-appointed sign, a labor contract for my room and board. 2 years. Every night, the piano played downstairs, and the men came up the steps with whiskey on their breath and money in their pockets. I didn't choose it. I didn't want it. But the law in Fort Worth belongs to the men who own the saloons. She looked up at him, her face wet with tears she wouldn't let fall. So you see, Jedediah, Ruth Hensley was right. The stain don't wash out. You don't want a woman with a past like mine. It would ruin your father's name, and it would ruin you. The silence that followed was longer than the road from Fort Worth. The wind died down, leaving nothing but the sound of the crickets in the grass. Jed didn't move away. He didn't drop his head. He looked at her, his face completely still, his blue eyes absorbing her words like dry earth taking in the first drops of rain. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out. His large, rough hand didn't go to her waist or her hair. He simply took her right hand, lifting it up between them. His thumb moved over her knuckles, the ones that had been blistered, the ones that were now healing from the tallow. Then he smiled. It wasn't a small, polite smile. It was a wide, stubborn, cowboy smile, full of the quiet certainty that had cleared these hills of predators 20 years ago. Clara, Jed said, his voice as steady as the caprock. A contract signed by a thief ain't a contract. It's just a piece of dirty paper. You didn't lose your soul in that place. You kept it alive enough to run away. That don't make you ruined. That makes you a survivor. He stepped closer, his boots clicking softly on the porch planks. He looked down into her green eyes, his face just inches from hers. I told you before, and I say it until the rain comes. I don't care about the girl in that past. She has gone. She stayed in Fort Worth. The only person I care about is the woman standing on this porch right now. I only care about our future. Clara looked at him, her lips parting in surprise. For 2 years, every man who had looked at her had looked with a price tag in his eyes. Jed Walker was looking at her like she was the only thing of value in the whole state of Texas. "You're a foolish man, Jed Walker," she whispered. But she didn't pull her hand away. "Maybe," Jed said, his smile softening as he let his thumb rest against her wrist, where her pulse was jumping like a trapped bird. "But a walker never backs off a claim once he's seen the worth of the ground. Come on inside. It's getting late, and the wind is coming up. A Texas sky in June, have mercy. It just hangs over the prairie like a sheet of blue brass, reflecting the heat until the mesquite bushes twist and warp in the haze. The cattle don't graze during the heat of the day. They just stand under the scrub oaks, their heads low, waiting for the shadows to lengthen. But a human being doesn't have the luxury of waiting." By the second week after the supper at Walker Ranch, a quiet routine had settled between Jed and Clara. Every Tuesday morning, before the sun could turn the metal rims of the wagon wheels into branding irons, Jed hitched his bay gelding alongside a high-sided buckboard outside the mercantile. He didn't come to buy chicory anymore. He came for her. "Hold the reins with your fingers, not your fists, Clara," Jed said, his voice dropping into that rhythmic low drawl. He was standing by the horse's shoulder, watching her hands. A horse is a creature of flesh and blood. If you pull too hard, you just teaching it to fight back. You give it a firm boundary, but you leave enough slack for it to choose to walk straight. Clara sat on the high bench, her gray wool dress tucked around her boots. She adjusted her grip on the leather straps. Her knuckles weren't white anymore. The tallow had healed the skin, leaving her hands smooth but firm. "Like people?" she asked, looking down at him through the shade of her bonnet. "Exactly like people," Jed said, stepping up onto the wagon hub and swinging himself onto the seat beside her. "A man who thinks he can force the world to do his bidding usually ends up with a broken rope and a runaway team. True strength ain't about the size of your whip. It's about the trust you build before the road gets steep." He took the leather lines for a second, demonstrating the subtle flick of the wrist that signaled the team to move. The mules dug their hooves into the red dust, and the wagon rolled forward with a rhythmic clacking groan for 3 miles. The only sound was the iron tires grinding against the limestone and the dry rattle of the grasshoppers in the brush. They were delivering 5 sacks of seed corn and 3 barrels of flour to the Miller homestead, 5 miles south where the timber grew thin. "Why haven't you taken a wife, Jed?" Clara asked, her eyes fixed on the trail ahead. A man with a ranch like this usually has 3 or 4 youngsters running around the yard by his 25th year. The folks in town say you read too particular. Jed smiled, a slow, quiet movement of his lips that didn't disturb the rest of his face. He adjusted the brim of his Stetson to block the glare. My father used to say a man shouldn't build a house until he's as sure of the foundation, Jed said. And he told me something else. Back when I was old enough to break my first colt, he said, Jed, don't you ever tie yourself to a person unless she's the one you want to talk to when the morning is cold and the wood is wet. I've seen plenty of women who could dance a reel or look pretty in a church pew, but I hadn't met anyone who could look at a hard trail and make me feel like the ride was worth the trouble. Not until 3 weeks ago. Clara looked away, her cheeks turning the color of a wild peach under her bonnet, but she didn't let go of the reins. She held them just the way he taught her, firm, but with enough grace to let the horses breathe. The trouble in town hadn't died down. It had just gone underground, like a fire burning through the dry roots of the grass. Ruth Hensley had organized a sewing circle on the porch of the parsonage, but nobody was looking at the stitches. They were looking across the street toward Guthrie's dry goods. When Clara walked out with a bucket of dirty water to scrub the entrance, the whispers rose up like grasshoppers in a dry wind, but Guthrie stepped out onto the boardwalk right then. She didn't have a shawl, and her gray hair was coming loose from her hairpins, but she stood 6 feet tall in her boots. She looked across the dirt road at Ruth Hensley and the 3 women sitting with their embroidery hoops. You ladies must have very clean parlors if you have this much time to watch my front porch, Mrs. Guthrie called out, her voice cracking across the quiet street like a pistol shot. Ruth Hensley didn't flinch. She set her needle down with a deliberate, sharp movement. We are simply concerned for the moral standing of this community, Martha. A town that allows its young men to be led astray by women with no visible history is a town that's inviting the judgment of the Lord. We have daughters to think about. Mrs. Guthrie took 3 steps forward, her heavy leather shoes thumping against the pine planks. She stopped at the edge of the boardwalk, pointing a thick, calloused finger at the preacher's wife, Ruth Hensley. You've been measuring other folks' cloth with your own short yardstick for 20 years, Mrs. Guthrie said. Her voice didn't shake. It had the heavy, slow rhythm of an old clock. This girl has worked for me for 4 weeks. She hasn't missed a morning. She hasn't shorted a customer, and she hasn't asked for a handout. The right to live in peace and earn an honest piece of bread by the sweat of your brow is the law of this land, and in essence the law of God. If you want to talk about stains, you might want to check the mud on your own hem before you start scrubbing another person's porch. Ruth's mouth snapped shut like a steel trap. She didn't answer, but she gathered her linens and went inside the house, her followers trailing behind her like sheep after a storm. Jed watched the whole thing from the hitching rail across the street. He didn't intervene because he knew Mrs. Guthrie didn't need a defender. When Clara came out to pick up her bucket, he walked over and stood by the post. The old lady has some bark on her, Jed said quietly. Clara looked at the closed door of the parsonage, then back at Jed. Why are they so afraid of me, Jed? I'm just one girl with a single suitcase. Jed looked at her, his blue eyes serious. They ain't afraid of you, Clara. They afraid of the mirror you holding up to them. A person who builds their whole life on being better than their neighbors can't stand to see someone walk out of the dark and find the light without asking for their permission. Out here, you don't need their permission to be whole. You just need the courage to keep walking. The heat didn't break when the sun went down. It stayed in the logs of the Walker Ranch house, making the pine timbers groan as they cooled. Silas Walker sat in his leather armchair behind the big cedar desk in his office. A single oil lamp burned between them, throwing long, greasy shadows across the whitewashed walls. Jed stood by the window, his arms crossed over his chest, looking out at the dark silhouette of the corral. I'm telling you for the last time, Jedediah, Silas said, his voice like rocks grinding together in a deep bucket. A man's name is the only thing that outlives his fence lines. You drag that Walker name into the dirt with a girl from the Fort Worth districts, and you'll be repairing that fence for the rest of your days. The town is already talking. The town don't pay our beef taxes, Father, Jed said without turning around. His voice was quiet, but it had a hard, rhythmic edge to it. And they don't help us dig the wells when the stock ponds dry up. Clara Preston is an honest woman. She's proved it every day she's been in Dusty Creek. An honest woman don't come off a night stage alone with no kin to vouch for her, Silas growled, slamming his palm flat against the desk. I've lived 58 years on this earth, boy. I know how the world works. People don't change their stripes just because they cross the county line. Jed turned around then. He looked at his father at the silver mustache, the white shirt, the proud slant of the old man's shoulders. She didn't choose the stripes, father, Jed said. The world painted them on her. There's a difference. Silas didn't answer. He just picked up his pipe, his eyes cold as flint. We'll see what the books say tomorrow. If she has as smart as you claim, she'll have the investment account sorted by noon. If she ain't, she can take the afternoon coach out of here, and you can go back to being a cattleman instead of a guardian angel. The next morning, the office was cool, but the air felt heavy, like the atmosphere before a dry lightning storm. Clara sat at the cedar desk, surrounded by the old tin lockboxes Silas had kept since the end of the war. She was sorting through the old receipts, land grants from 1872, cattle sales from the Abilene Trail, and the long lists of financial investments Silas had made in the northern counties during the Reconstruction boom. Her pen made a steady, scratching sound against the ledger paper. She was clearing out a stack of old quarterly statements from the Fort Worth Banking Exchange, dated 1876. She turned a page. Then she stopped. The ink on the document was faded, but the penmanship was large and clear. It was a partnership contract for a commercial property on Rusk Street, the heart of the Fort Worth Red Light District, to the sum of $2,000, advanced by Silas W. Walker of Dusty Creek, for the construction and maintenance of the establishment known as the Silver Moon. Said partner to receive 15% of quarterly dividends, paid through the Fort Worth Exchange, without requirement of personal oversight. Clara's hand went completely still. The steel nib of her pen hovered over the clean paper until a single drop of black ink fell, spreading into a dark, ugly stain on the white sheet. She didn't breathe. She looked at the signature at the bottom, Silas W. Walker, and right beside it, written in a slick, flamboyant hand she would know if she were blind, Silas Vance, manager. The room seemed to shrink. The smell of old paper turned into the smell of cheap whiskey, cigar smoke, and the stale perfume of the Silver Moon parlor. 2 years of her life, the locked doors, the piano playing downstairs. The tears she had dried on the rough cotton pillows had been paid for, in part, by the money that built the house she was sitting in right now. Silas Walker hadn't known her name. He hadn't known her face. He was just a businessman who wanted 15% on his capital and didn't care if the dividends smelled of blood or tears, as long as the bank draft cleared. A shadow fell over the desk. Clara jumped, her hand automatically moving to cover the document, but her fingers were shaking too hard. Jed was standing in the doorway, 2 tin cups of coffee in his hands. He saw her face the way her eyes were wide and hollow, her skin the color of skimmed milk. Clara, Jed said, setting the coffee down on the corner of the table. He stepped closer, his brow furrowing. What is it? Did you find a mistake in the cattle counts? Clara looked up at him. She looked at his honest, sun-browned face, his clear blue eyes, and the gentle way he stood there waiting to help her. Her throat felt like it was full of dry sand. Jed, she whispered, her voice cracking. Your father, is he an honest man? Jed stopped. He leaned his hands on the edge of the desk, looking down at her. My father is a hard man, Clara. He's stubborn, and he don't give an inch when he thinks he's right, but he's never stolen a steer, and he's never broken his word on a beef contract. Why are you asking me that? Clara slowly moved her hand away from the old paper. She didn't say a word. She just pointed her index finger at the name at the bottom of the faded document. Jed leaned down, his eyes scanning the lines. He read it once. He read it twice. Clara watched his jaw go completely rigid, the muscle under his sunburnt cheek twitching like a trapped wire. The silence in the room grew so thick you could hear the flies buzzing against the window pane. He didn't know, Jed said, his voice dropping into a register so low it didn't sound like him at all. He just put money into the Fort Worth Exchange after the big cattle drive in '75. He told me he invested in a hotel project down by the railroad tracks. It wasn't a hotel, Jed, Clara said. She didn't cry, her voice was flat, empty of everything but the old weight. It was the Silver Moon. The money that bought the timber for this desk, it's the same money that paid for the key to my room. Jed stood up straight. He looked at the white cedar ceiling, his chest rising and falling in short, sharp movements. His fists were clenched so tight at his sides that his leather cuffs groaned against the strain. The door to the office opened, and Silas Walker stepped in, his boots thumping against the floor. He had his silver-headed cane in one hand and a stack of mail in the other. Well, Silas asked, looking from Jed to Clara, Are the accounts balanced, or am I going to have to file for an extension with the county clerk? Why are you two standing there like you've seen a ghost? Jed didn't move. He stood between his father and the desk, his tall frame blocking the ledger from the old man's view. We found a ghost, father, Jed said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a cadence that made the old man stop right in his tracks. An old one, from 1876. Silas narrowed his eyes, his silver mustache twitching. What are you talking about, boy? A man who puts his money into the soil has to know what kind of seed he is buying, father, Jed said, his eyes fixed on the old man's face. That's what you taught me. You told me if a man buys a tainted bull, he's responsible for the whole herd going rotten. You remember saying that? Of course I remember, Silas said, his voice rising in anger. What does that have to do with the quarterly books? Jed stepped aside, revealing the document on the desk. He didn't point to it. He just let it sit there under the yellow light of the lamp. You might want to read your own contract, sir, Jed said quietly, the one you signed with Silas Vance. It turns out the Walker name has been doing business in the Fort Worth districts a lot longer than I thought, and the cost of that business is sitting right here at your table. Silas walked over, his heavy brows drawing together. He picked up the paper with his thick, calloused fingers. As his eyes moved down the script, the anger on his face didn't turn to fury, it turned to stone. The color drained out of his cheeks, leaving him looking older than his 58 years. He looked at the paper, then he looked at Clara, his blue eyes wide with a sudden, terrible realization. He didn't speak, he couldn't. For the first time in his life, Silas Walker had nothing to say. The heat in the back room of Guthrie's Dry Goods didn't move. It just sat on Clara's chest like a sack of wet oats. The air smelled of old calico, dried apples, and the vinegar barrel by the door. She lay on the canvas cot, her eyes fixed on a water stain on the ceiling. It looked like the shape of the Texas Panhandle, bitter and dry. Dr. Barnaby Gibson set his black leather bag on the floorboards with a dull thud. He took off his round spectacles, wiped them on his sleeve, and sighed. The glass caught the thin shaft of sunlight coming through the high window. You can sit up now, Clara, he said. His voice was small, tired. The kind of voice a man gets after 40 years of telling folks their babies are dead or their limbs have to come off. Clara pulled her gray wool skirt down over her boots. She sat up slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the cot. Her palms were sweating. Is it the fever, Doctor Gibson? She asked. Gibson didn't put his glasses back on right away. He looked at his shoes. No, it ain't the fever, girl. The fever comes and goes with the water supply. This is something else. You're carrying a child. 3 months along, if I had to put a mark on the calendar. The room went so quiet you could hear the termites chewing through the pine uprights in the wall. Clara didn't scream. She didn't cry. She had spent 2 years learning how to freeze her face when a man looked at her, and that old armor didn't fail her now. But inside her ribs, her heart felt like a wild horse slamming against a cedar fence. 3 months, Fort Worth, that meant the final. Dark weeks at the Silver Moon before she stole the ledger and crawled out the coal chute. Does anyone else know? Clara whispered. A doctor's bag stays shut for a reason, Clara, Gibson said, his hand lingering on the brass latch of his valise. But a small town has eyes like a hawk. You can't hide a crop when the seed starts to sprout. You need to think about who you going to tell. There is no one to tell, she said, her voice flat as a dry lake. The child don't have a father, not one with a name worth speaking. Gibson looked at her, his old eyes softening behind his lenses. A child ain't an invoice, Clara. It don't need a name at the top to be worth something, but you're 18 years old. A woman alone in this territory with an unbranded babe. It's a long row to hoe. I've hoed harder ground, she said. By 5 o'clock, the sun was dropping behind the livery stable, turning the dust in the street into a low cloud of gold. Clara walked out the back door of the mercantile, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders despite the lingering heat. She needed to walk. She needed to feel the ground beneath her boots to make sure she wasn't falling through the earth. She didn't expect to see the bay horse. Jed Walker was leaning against the hitching post by the water trough, his fingers idly braiding a piece of hemp twine. He looked up when the screen door creaked. He saw the way she walked, the slow, heavy placement of her heels, the way her chin was tucked down into her collar. He didn't ask if she was well. He knew she wasn't. The wind is coming from the south today, Jed said, his voice dropping into that easy, rhythmic cadence, carrying the smell of the Gulf. My father says a south wind either brings a storm or it just dries out the wells completely. He's sitting in his office, looking at that 1,876 receipt like it's a death warrant. Clara stopped 3 feet from him. She didn't look at his eyes. She looked at the silver buckle of his gun belt. "You need to let me go, Jed," she said. Jed stopped twisting the twine. He stood up straight, his tall shadow falling over her like an oak tree in the middle of a hot pasture. "I thought we settled that on the porch last week, Clara. I told you that was before," she cut in. She looked up then, her green eyes bright with an old, jagged anger. "That was when it was just an old story, a piece of paper in a tin box. Now it's real." "Jed," she took his hand, the large, calloused hand that had held the reins for her, and she placed it flat against her apron, just above her belt line. "Aim 3 months gone. Jedediah," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "The doctor told me an hour ago. The child belongs to the Silver Moon. It belongs to the men who bought the keys from Silas Vance. It's the past. Jed, it ain't staying behind in Fort Worth anymore. It's coming for us." Jed didn't pull his hand away. He left his palm flat against the coarse linen of her apron. He didn't blink. The silence between them stretched out, measured by the heavy, slow thumping of his pulse against her fingers. He looked down at the red dirt between his boots. Then he looked at her. He didn't look shocked. He looked like a man who had just seen a boundary marker he had been searching for all day. He took her hand out of his pocket, led her over to the shade of the loading dock, and made her sit down on a stack of cedar shingles. He sat right beside her, his long legs dangling over the edge. "A human life ain't a debt to be collected, Clara," Jed said. His voice was low, but it had that iron certainty that made the town gossips step back on Sundays. "The law of this territory might look at an unbranded calf and call it a stray, but a child ain't livestock. An innocent baby brought into this world don't carry the sins of the ground it was planted in." He reached out, his thumb catching a single tear before it could run down her dusty cheek. "Human love isn't a ledger where you balance the credits before you decide to show mercy," Jed said, his eyes locking onto hers. "If a man only stands by a woman when the sky is clear and her record is white as milk, then he ain't a man at all. He's just a fair-weather trader. If you have me, this child will bear the name Walker. I'll teach him how to ride, how to hold a rope, and how to look a man in the eye. No one in Dusty Creek will ever call him illegitimate while I am above the sod." Clara looked at his face, at the stubborn line of his jaw, the scar near his ear, the complete lack of fear in his blue eyes. For 2 years, she had been treated like property that had been damaged in transport. Jed was looking at her like she was the sanctuary itself. "They'll hate you for it," she whispered. "Your father will think you have lost your mind." "My father spent $2,000 building the walls that hurt you," Jed said, his face hardening as he looked toward the western ridge. "He owes this child a roof, and I owe you a life. We're staying right here." The dust didn't settle that night. A dry gale blew in from the Caprock, rattling the tin signs on the storefronts and making the kerosene lamps flicker in the parlor of the Copper Nail. A man came in on the 10 o'clock coach. He didn't look like the regular travelers who came down from Fort Worth. He didn't have grease on his cuffs or dust in his beard. He wore a suit of fine black broadcloth, a white linen shirt without a spot on it, and a gold watch chain that glinted like a snake in the lamplight. His boots were soft leather, the kind that didn't make a sound when he walked across the pine floorboards of the saloon. His name was Silas Blackjack Vance. He sat at the corner table, away from the drafts, his fingers idly turning a silver dollar over his knuckles. He didn't buy whiskey. He bought a bottle of spring water and asked Jimmy, the bartender, for a clean glass. "A small place you have here, friend," Vance said, his voice a smooth, low purr that sounded like silk being dragged over a rough table. "Quiet. A man could get lost out here if he wasn't careful." Jimmy wiped the counter with a greasy rag. "Most folks here don't want to be found, mister. That's why they came," Vance smiled, showing a row of white, even teeth. "I'm looking for an employee of mine, a young lady. Left Fort Worth about 2 months back without signing her release papers. Left with some property that belonged to the firm, too. A ledger, bounded in black calfskin. The black ledger wasn't a diary. Clara had told Jed the truth about it the night before, while the wind was howling through the corral. It was Vance's insurance policy. For 5 years, every judge who took a bribe, every marshal who looked the other way, and every politician who spent his evenings in the back rooms of the Silver Moon had their names, dates, and dollars written down in Clara's neat, schoolteacher script. It was enough dynamite to blow the roof off the state capitol in Austin. Clara hadn't taken it to sell. She had taken it because as long as she held that book, Blackjack Vance couldn't hang her from a tree without hanging himself first. Jimmy looked at the silver dollar on the table. He didn't know about the ledger, but he knew the girl at the mercantile. Everyone did. There's a girl working for Martha Guthrie, Jimmy said, his voice dropping. Clara Preston keeps the books. Vance stopped turning the coin. He let it drop flat against the cedar table with a sharp clink. Preston, Vance murmured. She always did like an old-fashioned name. Thank you, friend. Keep the bottle. Jed Walker saw the black-suited man before the sun was over the chimney tops. He was standing by his bay horse outside the livery stable when Vance walked out of the town inn, his boots polished, his gold chain catching the early light. A man who spent time on the border knew a wolf by the way it checked the wind. Vance didn't look at the buildings, he looked at the alleyways. He looked at the hitching rails to see which horses were saddled and ready for a long ride. Jed didn't hesitate. He walked straight across the dirt street, his spurs clinking against the hard-packed earth. He stopped 5 feet from Vance, his hands resting naturally near his belt line. You're a long way from the railroad tracks, mister, Jed said. Vance stopped. He looked at Jed at the wide shoulders, the leather cuffs. The Walker brand burned into the saddle skirt of the bay horse. Jedediah Walker, I presume, Vance said, his voice smooth as grease. Your father is a well-known man in Fort Worth, young gentleman. A very prudent investor. I've had the pleasure of sending him his dividends for several seasons. The partnership is dissolved, Jed said, his voice dropping into that rhythmic, dangerous drawl, and the accounts are closed. If you come for a settlement, you can talk to me. My father don't do business with the Silver Moon anymore. Vance took a silver case from his pocket, selected a thin cigar, and struck a match on the hitching post. He blew a ring of blue smoke into the dry air. I didn't ride 30 miles on a rough stage to talk to an old man about cattle funds, Mr. Walker, Vance said, his green eyes narrowing through the smoke. I came for my property, a girl named Clara, and a book she took from my desk. The book belongs to the exchange. The girl belongs to a labor covenant signed by the county court. Jed took a step closer. He didn't draw his iron, but his frame was tall enough to block the sun from Vance's face. A human being don't have an owner in this state, Vance, Jed said, his voice like a saw cutting through green oak. The war ended 13 years ago, in case you didn't get the news down in the districts. A labor covenant signed by a thief to trap an orphan girl ain't law, it's just kidnapping with a notary stamp. You touch that girl, or you walk onto Guthrie's porch, and you find out how we settle property disputes in Dusty Creek. Vance didn't flinch. He just took another drag of his cigar, his face completely calm. The law is a very flexible thing, young man, Vance said quietly. It goes where the money is. That book she has contains the names of men who can put you and your father in a federal penitentiary by sundown tomorrow if those pages are made public. I don't want to fight, I just want my ledger. You give me the book, and the girl can stay here until she rots for all I care. She's already damaged goods anyway, from what I hear. Jed's arm moved so fast the match in Vance's hand didn't have time to go out. He caught the saloon man by the lapels of his fine black broadcloth, lifting him off his heels until his shiny boots were scraping against the boardwalk. You speak about her like that again, Jed whispered, his face inches from Vance's nose, and they'll be hauling you back to Fort Worth in a pine box. The ledger stays where it is, and she stays with me. He dropped Vance back onto the planks. Vance stumbled, his face turning an ugly shade of gray, but he straightened his vest with a trembling hand. He didn't yell. He just looked at Jed with a cold, murderous promise in his eyes. You're a fool, Walker, Vance said, his voice shaking with a quiet rage. You think you re-protecting her. You re-just building her a bigger coffin. He turned and walked down the boardwalk toward the Dr. S office at the end of the street. Jed watched him go, his knuckles still white from the grip on the broadcloth. He knew the wolf had found the trail, and a wolf didn't leave the herd until it had tasted blood. The big cedar desk in the Walker Ranch office looked different under the pale light of a high noon. It didn't look like a piece of proud furniture anymore. It looked like an old chopping block. Jed Walker stood by the heavy timber door. He held the black calfskin ledger in his right hand. The leather was cool against his fingers, but the weight of it felt like 100 pounds of wet river gravel. Silas Walker sat in his high-back chair. He hadn't shaved, his silver mustache looked ragged, and his white linen shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, showing the wrinkled, sun-touched skin of his throat. He looked at the book in his son's hand like it was a timber rattlesnake that had crawled out from under his floorboards. You brought it into my house, Silas said. His voice was a low, hollow rasp. It was already in your house, father, Jed said. He walked forward, his boots striking the floor with a slow, deliberate thud. He placed the black book flat on the center of the cedar wood. Your name is on page 42, right beneath the entry for the lumber shipment that built the back stairs of the Silver Moon. Silas didn't reach for the book, he just stared at the gold lettering on the corner of the cover. I was an investor, Jedediah, the old man said, his chin rising just a fraction, trying to find his old pride in the corners of the room. The Fort Worth Banking Exchange handles $20,000 of my capital every year. They told me it was a dry goods syndicate and a commercial hotel. A man can't ride 30 miles every time a bank draft clears to see who's sweeping the steps. Jed leaned his hands flat on the desk, forcing his father to look him in the eye. A man is responsible for the tracks his money leaves. Father, Jed said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the cadence of a hammer striking an iron picket. The law of this frontier might let an investor hide behind a bank clerk in Fort Worth, but the truth don't recognize a silent partner. If a man profits from a cage, he is just as much a jailer as the fellow who turns the key. That girl sat at your table 3 nights ago. She ate your bread while your old investment funds were still paying for the locks on her history. Silas closed his eyes. His big liver-spotted hands began to shake against the arms of his chair. For 30 years he had been the law in Dusty Creek. He had hanged cattle thieves, broken wild horses, and built the biggest cattle brand between the Brazos and the Colorado. But right now, he looked like a tenant farmer whose crop had just been ruined by an afternoon hailstorm. What does she want? Jed, Silas whispered. Does she want the land? Does she want money to leave the county? She don't want your money, father, Jed said, his voice softening just a bit as he looked at the old man's slumped shoulders. She's had enough of Walker money to last her a lifetime. She just wants her life back. She wants to look at the horizon without seeing Blackjack Vance riding down the trail. The old man sat in the quiet room for 5 long minutes. The only sound was the rhythmic dry clicking of the grasshoppers outside the open window. Then, slowly, Silas stood up. He didn't use his silver-headed cane. He stood up on his own 2 legs, his joints popping in the heat. Get the team hitched, Jedediah, Silas said. Where are we going, sir? The old man said, pulling his black wool vest over his shoulders. A wrong thing don't get right by letting it sit in the shade. I'm going to look at that girl in the light. The ride into Dusty Creek was silent. The dust rose up around the buckboard like a red cloud, coating their teeth and their clothes, when they pulled up outside Guthrie's dry goods. Silas didn't wait for Jed to grab the lines. He swung his heavy leg over the wheel and stepped down into the dirt. Clara Preston was behind the counter, sorting a shipment of tin plates. When the bell over the door clanged, she looked up. She saw Silas Walker standing in the doorway, his tall frame blocking the afternoon sun. She didn't run. She didn't drop the plate in her hand. She just stood there, her green eyes turning cold and sharp as broken glass. Silas walked across the pine floorboards until he was standing 2 feet from the counter. He took off his Stetson, holding it against his stomach with both hands. Then, with 20 people watching through the front window, the richest man in the county slowly dropped to one knee on the dirty floor. The room went completely dead. Mrs. Guthrie stopped her broom in the corner. Mr. Walker, Clara said, her voice completely level. Get up. A man of your standing looks foolish on the floor. I am right where I belong, Miss Preston, Silas said, looking up at her with a face that looked like it had been carved out of an old fence post. I lived my whole life thinking that if my ledgers were clean, my soul was clear, but I was blind. My money helped put you in that place in Fort Worth. I didn't know your face, but that don't excuse the debt. A human being's freedom is a sacred thing given by the Almighty, and I let my capital be used to trim your lamp before you ever had a chance to see the day. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a heavy brass key, the key to the Walker Ranch safe. He laid it gently on the dry goods counter. I'm going to Austin with my son tomorrow, Silas said, his voice dropping into a deep, gravelly register that everyone in the store could hear. We retaking that black book to the federal marshal. I'm going to put my own signature on the affidavit against Blackjack Vance. My reputation will likely go into the ground, and the bank will probably call in my beef notes, but I'm going to ensure you walk free in this territory, even if I have to spend my remaining days sleeping on a saddle blanket. Clara looked at the old man for a long time. Her chest rose and fell beneath her gray apron. She didn't touch the key, but the cold hardness in her green eyes softened just a fraction, like ice melting in a spring creek. Stand up, Mr. Walker, she said gently, reaching down to touch his old shoulder. I don't need a man to ruin himself for me. I just need people to stop looking at me like I'm something the dog dragged in from the brush. Silas stood up, wiping the red dust from his knee. They won't look at you that way again, daughter. Not while there's a walker alive to stand between you and the wind. The dry gale came back after midnight. It howled through the gaps in the boardwalks, making the wooden rafters of the town clinic groan like an old ship. Jed Walker sat on his bay horse in the alleyway behind the Dr. S office. He had his collar turned up against the flying grit. His left arm was stiff, the muscle aching where a wild steer had pinned him against the corral rail the week before. But it wasn't the steer that was keeping him awake. It was the tracks in the dust. An hour ago, Dr. Barnaby Gibson had walked out his back door, carrying his medical bag and a small tin lantern. He hadn't gone to a homestead to deliver a baby. He had gone to the town inn, stayed for 10 minutes in room number 4, the room rented to Blackjack Vance, and then walked back with his head down. Jed dismounted, his boots making no sound in the soft dirt. He didn't draw his Colt. He just pushed the back door of the clinic open with his boot heel and stepped inside. The room smelled of carbolic acid, peppermint oil, and old alcohol. Dr. Gibson was sitting at his small desk, a half-empty bottle of rye whiskey between his elbows. His round spectacles were sitting crooked on his nose. "You're out late, Jedediah," Gibson said without looking up. His voice sounded like it had been dragged through sand. "The wind keeps a man from sleeping, Doctor," Jed said, stepping into the yellow circle of the lamp. "And so does a bad trail. I was just wondering what kind of medicine a man prescribes to a wolf like Blackjack Vance at 11 o'clock at night." Gibson went rigid. He reached for his whiskey glass, but his fingers were trembling so hard the glass clinked against the bottle. He slumped forward, his head falling into his hands. "I didn't have a choice, Jed," the doctor whispered, his shoulders shaking beneath his black wool coat. "Vance has my signatures from the gambling tables in Fort Worth 3 winters ago, $2,000 in drafts. He told me if I didn't confirm that Clara was here and that she was with child, he'd send those drafts to the medical board in Austin. They'd take my license before the month was out. I am 50 years old, Jed. I don't know how to do anything but heal folks. If I lose the clinic, I'm just a vagrant." Jed looked at the old doctor, at the thin gray hair, the dirty cuffs. The complete ruin of a man who had delivered half the children in Dusty Creek. "A man who sells a pregnant woman to clear his gambling debts ain't a doctor, Barnaby," Jed said. His voice was completely calm, which made it twice as dangerous. "He's just a trader in human misery. You let fear turn you into a hound for a monster. The law of this territory gives a patient the right to a safe harbor when they speak to a physician. And you turned her diagnosis into a map for a killer." "He's going to take her tonight, Jed," Gibson cried, looking up with wet, terrified eyes. He's got 2 regulators from the red light district with him. They waiting at the old Turner homestead on the eastern ridge. "Vance told me to tell you that Clara needed an emergency call out there, that one of the tenant families was sick. He figures you'll bring her in the buckboard, and they'll take the ledger and the girl off the wagon box in the dark." Jed stood still for a long second, listening to the wind rattle the tin shingles on the roof. "Then we shouldn't keep him waiting," Jed said quietly. The old Turner homestead was nothing but a collapsing log cabin and an empty stone well. 5 miles out where the prairie gave way to the rough cedar breaks, the moon was high and pale, throwing long, skeletal shadows across the white limestone hills. The buckboard rolled into the clearing at 2 in the morning. The iron tires made a sharp, grinding noise against the dry shale. Blackjack Vance stepped out from the shadow of the old cabin roof, his black coat flapping around his knees like the wings of a crow. 2 men in dirty canvas jackets stood behind him, their hands resting on the pommels of their Winchester rifles. "You're a punctual man, mister Walker," Vance called out, his voice smooth as grease despite the wind. "Did you bring the lady?" "And my book." The figure on the driver's seat didn't move. The wide-brimmed Stetson was pulled down low, and a gray wool shawl was wrapped tight around the shoulders. "The book is right here, Vance." A voice drawled from the seat. It wasn't Clara's voice. Jed Walker threw the shawl off his shoulders, his right hand moving with the speed of a striking viper. His Colt .45 cleared its holster before Vance's men could even lift their rifle barrels. A deafening report shattered the night quiet, the orange muzzle flash lighting up the clearing for a split second. The Winchester in the first regulator's hand flew into the brush, the man screaming as Jed's bullet tore through his knuckles. "Drop 'em!" A deep, roaring voice bellowed from the shadows behind the well. Silas Walker stepped into the moonlight, a double-barreled 10-gauge shotgun leveled straight at Blackjack Vance's chest. 2 of the oldest line riders from the Walker ranch came behind him, their Spencer carbines cocked and ready. Vance froze. His cigar fell from his mouth, the red sparks scattering in the dirt. His face looked completely white under the moonlight, the smooth composure vanishing like grease on a hot stove. "This is an illegal ambush, Walker," Vance hissed, his hands rising slowly toward his hat brim. The law in this county is standing right in front of you, Vance," Jed said, stepping down from the wagon box. His Colt still pointed at the center of the saloon man's forehead. "We don't lynch men in Dusty Creek anymore. We do things by the book. This black book right here." He pulled the ledger from under the wagon seat and tossed it onto the dirt at Vance's feet. "My father and I are riding to Austin with the morning stage," Jed said, his blue eyes flashing like cold steel. "You and your 2 hounds are going to sit in the county jail until the federal marshal comes down to fetch you. You thought you could buy this territory with your dirty drafts and your gambling debts, but you forgot one thing. The people out here might be dry, and they might be poor, but they ain't for sale." Silas Walker stepped forward, the heavy barrels of his shotgun never wavering. "Tie 'em up, boys," the old man ordered his line riders. "And let's get back to the ranch. I think the wind is finally shifting to the north." The north wind brought the clouds by Tuesday morning. They weren't the thin, wispy things that had mocked the county for 3 years. These were heavy, dark-bellied. They hung low over the caprock, smelling of wet slate and deep river water. The air felt thick, different, like the whole prairie was holding its breath, waiting for the first crack in the sky. Jed Walker stood on the platform of the Dusty Creek stage station. His left arm was bound tight in a clean white sling under his denim jacket. The bullet from the eastern ridge had left a neat groove through the muscle, but it hadn't touched the bone. He didn't seem to notice the ache. He was watching the 2 federal deputies hoist Silas "Blackjack" Vance up into the iron-barred coach. Vance didn't look like a king anymore. His fine black broadcloth suit was torn at the shoulder, covered in a thick layer of red Texas mud. His shiny leather boots dragged through the dirt. The gold watch chain was gone, locked away in the marshal's evidence pouch alongside the black calfskin ledger. He looked back at Jed through the iron window of the door. His eyes were still small and dark, like 2 burnt matches. "You think this is the end of it, young gentleman?" Vance spat, his voice trembling with a quiet, bitter venom. "That book has 30 names in it. Men who own banks in Dallas, men who write the statutes in Austin. You think those fellows are going to let a pair of cattle herders pull the rug out from under them?" Jed walked to the edge of the boardwalk, his boots striking the wood with that slow, steady rhythm. He looked down at the saloon man. "The law don't belong to the names in that book, Vance," Jed said. His voice was low, carrying clear over the rattle of the stage harnesses. "The Constitution of this land wasn't written to protect a syndicate of thieves hiding behind high collars. It was written to ensure every citizen has the right to walk free without being treated like property. Those men in Austin will have to face the same jury as any common horse thief. The truth don't check a man's bank account before it strips him bare." The driver cracked his long leather whip, and the stagecoach lurked forward, its heavy iron tires churning the dry ruts into powder as it headed north toward the federal court. The town didn't wait for the trial to change its mind. Change out here doesn't happen like a sudden flash of lightning. It happens like water wearing away a limestone cliff, slow, steady, 1 grain at a time. On Wednesday noon, the community gathered at the church for the monthly town council meeting. The pews were full. The men sat on the left, their hands resting on their knees, while the women sat on the right, their fans clicking against their palms in the heavy air. Ruth Hensley stood by the altar rail, her black silk skirts completely still. She looked at the floorboards, her lips pressed into a thin, tight line. She didn't look up when Clara Preston walked through the back door. Clara wore her gray wool dress, but she had taken off her apron. She walked down the center aisle, her chin up, her green eyes looking straight ahead. She sat down in the very front pew, right next to Mrs. Martha Guthrie. Silas Walker stood up from the front row. He didn't have his silver cane, but his shoulders were squared, his white hair combed back neatly. He turned to face his neighbors. "I have a confession to make to this valley," Silas said, his deep, gravelly voice filling the rafters. "And I want it written in the town minutes. For 3 years, I've been calling myself the pillar of this community. I gave the timber for this roof, and I paid for the bell in the tower. But I was building my house on a foundation of blind ignorance." He stopped. He looked at Clara, then back at the crowd. "My capital helped build the walls that hurt this girl," Silas said, his voice dropping into a register that made the room completely silent. "I didn't ask where the money came from, because the bank drafts were regular and the ledger looked clean. But a man's moral duty don't end at the boundary of his own fence lines. We are our brother's keeper, and we are our sister's keeper too. If we allow an injustice to happen in Fort Worth just so we can buy cheap salt in Dusty Creek, then we are just as guilty as the fellow holding the whip and giving 1,000 acres of the Lower Creek pasture to Miss Preston. It's her property under the law, signed and recorded this morning, not as charity, but as a debt paid to a human being who was wronged by my neglect. He sat down. Ruth Hensley stood up slowly. Her hands were tucked into her sleeves. She looked at Clara for one long second. Then she looked at the altar. The Altar Guild needs a new secretary to keep the accounts for the winter social, Ruth said, her voice dropping its usual high, sharp edge. The old books are a muddle. If Miss Preston has the time, we would be grateful for her hand. Clara didn't stand up. She just nodded her head once, her green eyes softening just a fraction. The books will be clean, Mrs. Hensley, she said. 6 months later, the drought was nothing but a memory written in the deep ruts of the valley road. The creek was running 3 feet deep, the clear water rushing over the limestone boulders, making a sound like a distant crowd cheering. The grass on the high ridges was green again, thick, rich blue stem that came up to a horse's knees. Inside the Walker Ranch house, the kitchen smelled of boiling vinegar, cloves, and fresh cedar smoke. Jed Walker sat by the wide pine table, using a small pocket knife to whittle a piece of soft willow wood into the shape of a small toy horse. His arm was completely healed, the blue denim sleeve rolled up to the elbow, showing the thick muscle of his forearm. From the small bedroom down the hall, a sound broke the quiet. It wasn't the sound of the wind or the rattle of the shutters. It was a sharp, thin cry, a new voice. Jed stopped whittling. He let the pocket knife drop flat against the table. He stood up, his heart thumping against his ribs like a horse trying to break out of a box stall. The door opened and Mrs. Guthrie stepped out, her apron spotted with water, her gray face wrinkled into a wide, triumphant smile. She didn't say a word. She just nodded her head toward the dark hallway. Jed walked down the boards, his boots making a soft, rhythmic clicking against the cedar pine. He pushed the bedroom door open. The room was cool, the window open just an inch to let in the smell of the wet earth and the northern rain. Clara lay on the bed, her auburn hair damp against the white cotton pillow. She looked tired, her skin pale. Her lips chapped from the long labor, but her green eyes were bright, focused entirely on the small bundle wrapped in a flannel blanket beside her arm. Jed sat down on the edge of the mattress. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just reached out his big calloused hand, his fingers moving carefully, reverently, until they touched the baby's tiny wrinkled cheek. The boy had a patch of dark hair and a tiny fist that was clenched tight against his chin. He looks like he's ready to fight the whole territory, Jed whispered, a slow smile breaking across his sun-browned face. Clara looked up at him, her fingers reaching out to lace through his. He's got his health, Jed, that's the main thing. Dr. Gibson said his lungs are clear as a bell. She paused, her eyes searching his face. Have you thought about a name? My father's name was James. It's an old name, a quiet one. Jed looked at the child, then he looked at Clara. He reached down and took the tiny, soft fist between his thumb and forefinger. James Walker, Jed said, his voice dropping into that deep, rhythmic cadence that had grounded her since the day she stepped off the stagecoach. It sounds like a man who knows how to hold a claim. It's a good name for a boy who's going to grow up on the lower pasture. Clara leaned her head back against the pillow, a single tear running down her cheek, but her lips were smiling. You're sure, Jed? She asked, her voice dropping into a whisper. You aren't worried about what folks down in Fort Worth will say when the court records are published? They'll know when he was born. Jed leaned down, his face close to hers, his blue eyes clear and unblinking under the yellow lamplight. A human life don't start with a debt, Clara, Jed said, his voice firm as the timber in the walls. The law of this world can say what it wants about dates and calendars, but the truth of a family is built on the love we choose to give, not the permissions we beg from our neighbors. This child didn't choose the trail that brought you here, but he's got the whole prairie ahead of him now. We don't look back at the dust, Clara. We only care about the ground we're rebuilding on today. He leaned down and pressed his lips against her damp forehead, his hand keeping her fingers anchored to the bed. Outside the window, the rain began to fall in earnest. It wasn't a sudden, violent storm. It was a steady, rhythmic drumming against the cedar shingles, washing away the old red dust of Dusty Creek, turning the parched limestone hills into something new and clean. Dusty Creek wouldn't forget the girl with the single suitcase. It wouldn't forget the black ledger or the man in the broadcloth suit, But as the rain filled the creeks and the grass rose up to meet the sky, the valley learned to look at the porch of the Walker Ranch and see nothing but a family, standing together, looking out at the wide and open future. This fictional story may include themes of romance, betrayal, violence, hardship, or emotional distress that could be sensitive for some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised, as the purpose of these scenes is to create dramatic tension and emotional depth within the narrative world.
And so, as the rain finally falls over Dusty Creek, this story leaves us with more than the image of a family standing together on the edge of a new beginning. It reminds us that a person's worth is never measured by the cruelty they have survived, the rumors others have spoken, or the shame someone else tried to place upon their name. Clara Preston arrived in town with nothing but a small suitcase, a wounded heart, and a past she did not choose. Yet through courage, endurance, and the quiet refusal to surrender her dignity, she proved that broken ground can still bear good fruit. Jed Walker teaches us another kind of strength, the strength to stand beside someone when the whole world steps away. True love is not built on perfect histories or easy roads. It is built in the hard moments, when a man chooses compassion over pride, truth over reputation, and humanity over gossip. Jed did not save Clara because she was helpless. He stood with her because he recognized what others refused to see, that she was not ruined, but resilient, not stained, but surviving. Silas Walker's journey reminds us that redemption begins when a person has the courage to face the harm they helped create, even unknowingly. It is easy to call ourselves good people when our hands look clean. It is much harder to ask where our comfort came from, whose pain paid for our profit, and whether silence has made us part of someone else's suffering. His confession shows that it is never too late to do what is right, but righteousness demands more than words. It demands sacrifice. This story asks every one of us to look at the strangers who come into our lives with a little more mercy. Behind every tired face may be a battle we know nothing about. Behind every quiet woman, every lonely traveler, every person carrying shame, there may be a soul fighting simply to begin again. And sometimes the greatest gift we can offer is not judgment, not charity, but a place to stand without fear. In the end, Dusty Creek was changed not by rain alone, but by truth, courage, and grace. The red dust could cover boots, roads, and rooftops, but it could not bury the dignity of a woman who kept walking. And that is the heart of this tale. No past is powerful enough to destroy a future built with love, honesty, and forgiveness. As long as there are people brave enough to stand for the wounded, speak for the silenced, and choose mercy when judgment is easier, even the driest land can bloom again.